It was a night wrapped in silence and tension, a world asleep, unaware that the rhythm of freedom was about to echo across the dark roads of Massachusetts. Under the faint glow of a waxing moon, a man prepared to ride into history, not with an army or a musket, but with a message, a whisper that would awaken a nation. This is not just the tale of Paul Revere's midnight ride, it's the story of how courage, when spoken softly, can still roar through the centuries. Before we begin this quiet journey through time, make sure you subscribe to Whispered History Tales, where forgotten nights and timeless courage are softly brought back to life. Now, let's ride into that fateful night together.
The spring of 1775 came to Boston with a strange kind of stillness. The harbor, once alive with merchant ships and the shouts of dockhands, now carried the heavy presence of British warships, their sails black against the morning fog. The colonies were restless, torn between loyalty and liberty, and somewhere among them was a silversmith, a quiet craftsman named Paul Revere, whose hands had long shaped silver and metal, but who was about to shape something far greater, history. By that April evening, whispers filled every tavern and parlor. The British troops, it was said, were preparing to march, but where? Rumors said they were headed to Concord to seize hidden gunpowder and arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two of the most wanted patriots in the colonies. The message had to be carried quickly. The colonies needed to be warned before the redcoats began their march. And so, under the fading light, a plan took form. Paul Revere was not chosen for his strength or rank. He was chosen for his reliability, for the quiet confidence in his eyes, and for the way he knew every bend, every trail, every stone wall between Boston and Concord. He had ridden before, dozens of times, as a courier for the Sons of Liberty, a secret group fighting for independence. But this night would be different. This night would test not just his courage, but his faith in what America could become. The plan began in Boston's North End. Revere was to cross the Charles River by rowboat, slipping past the watchful eyes of the British ships anchored near the harbor. He carried no sword, no pistol, only a small packet of papers and a whispered purpose. Before he left, he made one quiet arrangement that would outlive him in legend. He instructed friends to hang lanterns in the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, to signal the route of the British troops. As he stepped into the small wooden boat, the oars dipping silently into the black water, the cold wind cut through his coat. Across the river, in the distance, Boston's lights shimmered like dying stars. Revere said nothing. There was nothing to say. When his feet finally touched the muddy banks of Charlestown, he found a horse waiting, a fast one, chosen carefully by patriot friends. He swung into the saddle, pulled his cloak tighter, and whispered to the horse, as though the animal understood, "Tonight, old friend, we ride for liberty." Then, with a firm kick, they disappeared into the dark countryside. The night was unusually still, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Revere knew the British patrols were everywhere. If he were caught, it would mean prison or worse. Yet he rode with a calmness that came from conviction. To him, this was not just a warning mission, it was an act of faith. Along the way, he stopped at nearly every farmhouse, knocking softly, calling out with measured urgency, "The regulars are coming out." The phrase would later twist in memory into the famous "The British are coming." But Revere knew better. Every colonist still considered themselves British. This was not yet a war between nations, but between principles. The miles passed slowly. Revere's horse galloped through fields still wet with dew, past fences and shadowed barns. Dogs barked in the distance. Candles flickered in windows as families stirred from uneasy sleep. In those moments, the countryside awoke, not to chaos, but to purpose. Men rose from their beds, shouldered their muskets, and began their own quiet march toward destiny. By the time Revere reached Lexington, his message had spread faster than he could ride. Samuel Adams and John Hancock, roused from rest, listened to his urgent words. Adams reportedly smiled, not from fear, but from satisfaction. "This night," he said softly, "the people have shown themselves ready." Revere had done what he set out to do, but his night was far from over. He knew the troops were still on the move, and he would continue to Concord before dawn. For now, he stood outside the Buckman Tavern, wiping the sweat and mud from his brow, the first faint light of morning breaking in the east. The wind carried the smell of spring, sharp and cold, and the faintest sound of drums somewhere far away. Paul Revere didn't know what the morning would bring. He didn't know that within hours, shots would be fired on the Lexington Green, the first blood of the Revolution. He didn't know that his midnight ride would become legend, retold and reshaped for generations. He only knew that for one brief night he had done what a free man must do: ride, warn, and believe. In the quiet before sunrise, Revere turned his horse toward Concord once more. The air trembled with anticipation. Behind him, the lanterns still glowed in the church tower, faint beacons of hope flickering over a land about to awaken. The dawn of April 19th, 1775, crept over Massachusetts with a nervous kind of beauty. Mist rolled low across the meadows, and the birds sang as though the world were still at peace. But Paul Revere knew better. The roads behind him had already begun to stir with the murmurs of men arming themselves, and the soft glow of lanterns being snuffed out as farmers prepared for war. He pressed his horse forward toward Concord, his cloak flapping in the early wind, heart steady, purpose clear. The world was on the edge of something vast, and no one yet knew what it would cost. Revere rode into the morning fog, his boots and saddle damp with dew, his voice, hoarse from hours of riding, carried through the fields as he stopped again and again to alert the sleeping patriots. "Up, men, to arms, the regulars are out." His words cut through the fog like steel through silk, and each echo brought another door opening, another musket loaded, another spark in the chain of defiance that would soon ignite across the colonies. As he neared the outskirts of Lexington once more, two riders joined him: William Dawes, who had taken a different route, and Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young spirited physician who had been returning home from a visit to his sweetheart. Together they formed a strange trio: the silversmith, the messenger, and the doctor. But for those precious miles they were united by a single thought: freedom. The three men rode hard toward Concord. The moon was sinking low now, its pale light giving way to the dull gray of pre-dawn. The road was narrow and rough, bordered by stone walls and thickets that could easily conceal soldiers. They spoke little, their breath visible in the chill, their minds fixed on the task. Then suddenly, movement ahead. Out of the fog emerged a small band of mounted British officers, red coats glinting faintly in the dim light. The riders drew up short. Revere's heart leaped. There was no time to think. "Scatter," he hissed, pulling sharply on the reins. The three patriots turned off in different directions, hooves pounding wildly over the uneven ground. Shots cracked behind them, warning shots, or perhaps something worse. Revere's horse stumbled, but recovered, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his ears. He veered down a narrow path, only to find himself suddenly surrounded. 2 officers on horseback blocked his way, their pistols drawn. "Stop, sir," one barked. "In the name of the king." Revere slowed his horse, his mind racing. Escape was impossible. The soldiers dismounted, grabbing the reins and pulling him roughly to the ground. "Who are you, and what is your business?" one demanded. Paul Revere, still panting, met their gaze with quiet defiance. "I am a messenger of the people," he said simply. "And if you think you can stop what's coming, you know nothing of this land." The soldiers searched him, finding no weapons. They questioned him for what felt like hours. Where were the rebel leaders? How many men were gathering? Where were the stores of gunpowder? Revere answered little, keeping his tone steady, his words careful. He knew the British underestimated him, thinking him just a common tradesman. But his silence was stronger than any musket. Finally, one of the officers, perhaps weary, perhaps uneasy, decided he wasn't worth the trouble. They took his horse and released him into the early light, miles from where he needed to be. His legs ached, but his spirit didn't waver. He began to walk, his boots sinking into the damp earth, determined to reach Lexington once more. By the time Revere trudged back into town, the world had changed. The morning sun was breaking through the fog, and the first shouts of alarm were rising from the green. In the distance, he could see lines of British soldiers marching, bayonets gleaming. The militia, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers stood facing them, muskets trembling in their hands. The air was heavy, charged. Then, somewhere no one could later say exactly where, a single shot rang out. That sound split the morning like lightning, the first shot of the American Revolution. Revere stood frozen for a heartbeat, the echo lingering in his chest. Then came the volley's smoke, shouting, confusion. Men fell, others ran, some fired wildly into the haze. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. The British line advanced, methodical, unstoppable, but the spirit of defiance refused to die. By mid-morning, the fighting had spread along the road to Concord. Revere, exhausted but alive, made his way toward a nearby house where the Patriot leaders were being sheltered. There, he saw Hancock's carriage being readied for escape, and men carrying documents and muskets out the back door. "They've fired," Revere gasped. "They've begun it." SamuelAdams.com, even in crisis, turned to him. "Then, Mr. Revere," he said softly, "it has begun, indeed." Outside, the war drums of history were beating. The British soldiers, who had once marched confidently down the country roads, now found themselves harried by angry farmers, firing from behind trees and stone walls. The countryside had awakened and would never sleep again. Paul Revere, watching the smoke rise over Lexington and Concord, felt a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. The cost of freedom had just been paid in blood, and there was no turning back. The silversmith who had once engraved silver cups and tea sets would now etch his name, quietly and forever, into the soul of a new nation. He turned toward Boston, his clothes torn, his voice hoarse, but his heart certain. The road behind him was lined with courage, not just his own, but that of thousands who would now stand and fight for liberty, for home, for the right to breathe free. The quiet courage that had begun in a whisper had now become a roar. As the smoke of battle drifted over the Massachusetts countryside, the echoes of that first musket shot rippled far beyond Lexington and Concord. The war that had been whispered about in taverns and meeting houses was now real. Families watched from their doorsteps as sons, husbands, and fathers took up arms, not knowing whether they would ever return. For Paul Revere, there was no time to rest. Though his mission had ended in capture and exhaustion, the cause had only just begun, and he knew that words and truth were now as powerful as gunpowder. Boston, his home, was a city under siege. British troops patrolled the streets, their redcoats a constant reminder of the Empire's grip. Yet, beneath the surface, rebellion pulsed like a heartbeat. Messages traveled through secret channels, hidden under loaves of bread, or carried by children pretending to play. Revere, still marked by his midnight ride, became a courier again, not on horseback this time, but through ink, whispers, and quiet determination. He printed engravings of the battles, distributed broadsheets describing the massacre at Lexington, and fanned the flames of outrage. The British called him a propagandist. The colonists called him a patriot. And though many would forget his name in the larger storm to come, in those early weeks, his courage became the spark others needed to stand firm. At night, as the city lights dimmed, Revere would sometimes stand at his workshop window and stare toward the dark hills beyond the Charles River. Somewhere out there, men were building barricades, forging muskets, and pledging their lives to a new cause. The sound of hammers in the distance was no longer just the rhythm of labor, it was the heartbeat of a revolution. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and their children huddled safely away from the city. He thought of the men who had fallen on the green, faces he would never forget. And he thought of the strange, uncertain future that now stretched before them all. Freedom had been declared with courage, but it would have to be earned with sacrifice. In the months that followed, Boston transformed into a city divided. The British fortified their positions, and colonial militias gathered in the surrounding countryside, cutting off supplies. Rumors spread like wildfire that reinforcements from England were on their way, that Washington himself was coming to lead the cause, that the British would soon strike again. Revere moved quietly among the patriots, carrying news, sketching maps of enemy positions, and warning of spies. He became a ghost in his own city, seen by many, known by few. His silver shop, once filled with the music of the hammer and the glow of molten metal, now served as a meeting place for the Sons of Liberty. The men who gathered there were blacksmiths, printers, and farmers, but together they were the architects of rebellion. One night, as the men whispered over candlelight, a sudden pounding came at the door. Every head turned, muskets were drawn. The door creaked open, revealing a young boy, breathless from running. "The British," he gasped. "They're preparing to move again." Revere exchanged a glance with another rider, Israel Bissell, who had carried messages farther south. Without a word, Revere gathered his cloak and pistol. "Then we'll ride again," he said. The others nodded. The pattern was set, the message clear. Liberty demanded sleepless nights and endless courage. Outside, the night air was sharp, the stars hidden behind low clouds. He mounted a borrowed horse and rode through the narrow streets, his heart pounding not from fear, but from purpose. He had done this before. And though the danger was real, capture, imprisonment, even death, the mission was worth every risk. Along the road, he passed quiet homes and empty fields. In one window, a candle burned, a signal left for riders like him. He raised his hand in acknowledgement and pressed on. The hooves of his horse struck sparks from the stones. marking a path that would one day be remembered as sacred ground. As he rode, Revere's thoughts drifted back to the night of April 18th, to the faces of the men who had stood with him, to the sound of their voices, steady and strong. "If the British march by land or by sea," he murmured to himself, remembering the signal from the Old North Church. 2 lanterns had shone that night, a message to the world that the spirit of freedom cannot be contained. He realized something then, something he hadn't understood before. The ride had not been about him, or even the warning itself. It had been about awakening. It was about turning ordinary men into defenders of an extraordinary idea that people could govern themselves, that no king could own their minds or hearts, that even a silversmith could change the course of history. As dawn approached once more, Revere slowed his horse at the edge of a hill overlooking the countryside. Smoke from distant campfires curled into the sky. The militia was gathering again, hundreds, maybe thousands strong now. Men with patched coats, women carrying water and bread, children watching with wide eyes. A nation still unborn was taking its first breath. Revere dismounted and stood in the cool morning air, listening. Somewhere a rooster crowed. Somewhere else a hammer rang out on an anvil. The world was moving unstoppable. He looked back toward Boston, its skyline faint in the distance. The church spires gleamed in the rising sun. The city he loved was still chained, but not for long. The tide had turned, and no empire, however mighty, could hold back what was coming. Paul Revere closed his eyes for a moment and whispered a quiet prayer, not for safety, but for endurance, because he knew this was only the beginning. The real battle would not be fought with muskets alone, but with belief, the stubborn, unshakable belief that freedom was worth every scar it would bring. And as he mounted his horse once more and rode into the light of a new day, he smiled faintly. The road was long, but the spirit that guided it was eternal. The months following the first shots at Lexington and Concord brought with them a strange mixture of hope and terror. Across Massachusetts, the fields that once yielded quiet harvests were now churned with footprints and cannon tracks. Smoke rose from the forges, where blacksmiths worked day and night, hammering muskets and bayonets instead of plowshares. And in every tavern, men whispered of liberty, while mothers hushed their children to sleep with stories of bravery instead of lullabies. The revolution was no longer an idea, was a living, breathing force. And for Paul Revere, it was becoming a way of life. Boston was now the center of the storm. The British troops, cut off and surrounded by colonial militias, grew restless. Their red coats, once symbols of power, now marked them as targets for the people's anger. Supplies ran thin, tempers shorter still, and while generals plotted their next moves, it was men like Revere who carried the messages that made the plans possible. He became a silent thread in the great tapestry of rebellion, always moving, always listening. One gray morning, as the harbor lay cloaked in mist, Revere found himself summoned to a meeting in a small room above a printing shop. The men gathered there were familiar: Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Joseph Warren. Their faces were drawn, eyes heavy with sleepless determination. On the table lay a map of Boston, pins marking British positions. "Their ships watch every movement on the water," Hancock murmured. "But if we could reach Charlestown with word of their next march." Revere leaned forward, tracing the map with his finger. By night, with the tide low, a small boat could slip past their guardships, he said. The lanterns in the Old North Church could signal again if needed. Warren nodded, just as before. Then he looked at Revere, his gaze steady. Would you make that ride again, should it come to that? Revere met his eyes. I would, Doctor, 1,000 times over. That night, as the city slept under British occupation, Revere prepared once more. The sound of waves lapping against the wharf mixed with the distant murmur of soldiers' boots. He moved quietly through the alleys, his cloak pulled tight against the cold. Every creak of a shutter, every bark of a dog made his heart quicken, but he didn't falter. Freedom, he knew, demanded quiet courage, not loud glory. He reached the wharf, where 2 trusted patriots waited with a small skiff. The harbor stretched before them, dark and vast. Lanterns glowed faintly aboard the British warships anchored in the distance, their reflections trembling on the black water. The men rowed silently, the oars dipping and rising without a splash. Revere sat in the bow, his eyes fixed on the far shore. The night air bit at his face, but his mind was clear. Behind him lay a city under siege. Ahead, a people preparing to defy an empire. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the fate of a nation waited to be born. When they reached the Charlestown side, a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows. We saw your signal, the man said softly. 2 lanterns again. They're planning another movement. Yes, Revere replied. Across the river. They mean to seize the stores at Concord once more. The militia must be warned. The messenger nodded grimly and vanished into the night. Revere turned back toward the water, the wind tugging at his coat. He felt the weight of it all, pressing on him, the endless danger, the constant uncertainty. But beneath it, there was something else, purpose. The kind of purpose that makes a man forget his fear. By dawn, he was back in Boston, slipping through side streets as British patrols marched by. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, reminder that peace was now a memory. The city's old rhythms had changed forever. Where children once played in the squares, sentries now stood guard. Churches that once rang with hymns now echoed with meetings and plans. The revolution had seeped into every corner of life. Revere's home, too, bore the marks of it. His silver tools lay idle, gathering dust, while his desk overflowed with letters, maps, and coded messages. His wife greeted him with quiet relief each time he returned, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "How long can this go on?" she whispered one evening as they sat by the fire. "Until it's done," he answered softly. "Until they know we will not kneel." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Across the colonies, word spread of battles won and lost. Bunker Hill, so close to home, brought both pride and heartbreak. Revere had watched the hill burn from his rooftop, smoke blotting out the sun. Though the Patriots had retreated, they had stood their ground longer than anyone believed possible. It proved something vital, that the mighty British Army could bleed. After Bunker Hill, everything changed. The British tightened their grip, and the colonists hardened their resolve. Washington arrived to take command of the Continental Army, and the siege of Boston became a test of endurance. Revere, ever the courier, carried dispatches between camps, his knowledge of every back road and secret passage saving countless lives. Once, while riding through the countryside under a moonless sky, he came across a farmhouse where an old woman stood alone on the porch. She looked up at him, her face lined with age and fear. "Are they coming again?" she asked. "Maybe," he said gently. "But so are we." She nodded slowly, her gaze fierce. "Then God keep you, rider." It struck him then this wasn't just his fight, or Adams's, or Washington's. It was theirs. The weavers, the farmers, the mothers and children who refused to surrender to tyranny. The revolution wasn't just being fought with bullets. It was being kept alive with belief. When he finally returned to Boston after another long journey, the city was stirring with rumors. The British were preparing to leave. Supplies were low, morale lower, and sure enough, one crisp March morning in 1776, the impossible happened. The British ships began to pull anchor. Revere climbed to the roof of his workshop and watched, breath held, as the sails unfurled and the fleet drifted out toward the open sea. For the first time in years, the harbor was quiet. The air smelled of salt and victory. The siege was over. Boston, his home, was free. He closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his face. The revolution was far from won, but for this moment, freedom had a foothold. And Paul Revere, the man who once rode through the night to warn his sleeping neighbors, smiled, because this was why he had ridden, for the chance to see a free dawn rise over his city. In the weeks after the British evacuation, Boston transformed almost overnight. The streets that once echoed with the tramp of redcoats now rang with the laughter of children and the sounds of rebuilding. Flags, stitched hastily by proud hands, fluttered from rooftops, and church bells, silenced for so long, pealed in triumphant song. Yet beneath the celebration, there lingered an understanding. The war was far from over. Paul Revere knew it better than anyone. The British had only retreated, not surrendered. Other colonies were still under siege. The battles that would define America were still to come. And though Boston now breathed freely, Revere's work was not finished. His shop once again became a meeting place for patriots. Maps and correspondence littered his workbench alongside half-finished silver goblets. Every knock on the door brought new messages orders from generals, pleas from soldiers, families, or whispered intelligence from spies. Revere, once just a craftsman, was now the connective tissue of a revolution. One cold evening, as snow drifted through the narrow lanes, a young messenger arrived breathless at Revere's door. From General Warren's men, he gasped. They need someone to ride north. Supplies are thin in New Hampshire. The militias there must be warned to prepare for movement. Revere didn't hesitate. I'll leave before dawn. He packed lightly, his saddlebag with maps, powder, and dried provisions, his pistol cleaned and ready, and around his neck, a small charm his wife had given him, a reminder of home, of warmth, of why he rode. The journey north was perilous. Winter in New England was no gentle thing. Bitter winds cut through his cloak, and the roads turned to rivers of ice. But mile after mile, he pressed on, his horse's breath rising in ghostly plumes. Villages lay silent under snow, their windows glowing faintly in the night. Sometimes a farmer or blacksmith would recognize him and offer food or shelter. More often, he rode through darkness alone. One night, as he passed through a frozen valley, a group of men emerged from the trees. They wore rough coats and bore muskets. Who goes there? One called. Revere raised his hands. A friend of liberty, he said evenly. The men lowered their weapons when they recognized him. You're the Boston rider, one said with a grin. We've heard of your midnight ride. Revere smiled faintly. Then you know I bring no harm, only warning. They invited him to their camp, a cluster of small fires glowing beneath the pines. There men sat huddled in tattered coats, muskets propped beside them, faces hollow from hunger, but eyes bright with conviction. They passed him bread and talked of the latest rumors, Washington's efforts to fortify New York, whispers of French sympathies abroad, and the uncertain loyalty of neighboring towns. As the night deepened, Revere told them of Boston's freedom, of how ordinary men had stood against the Empire's might. The soldiers listened in silence, the crackle of the fire punctuating his words. When he finished, one young man leaned forward. "Do you think we can win, Mr. Revere?" he asked quietly. Revere looked around at the weary, determined faces. "Aye," he said, "not because we're stronger, but because we believe. Empires rise and fall, but belief outlasts them all." By dawn, he was gone again, leaving the camp still wrapped in its fragile hope. The snow was falling heavier now, and each mile was a battle of its own. But at last, he reached Portsmouth, where local leaders met him with gratitude and resolve. They promised to rally their militias, to ready arms and aid. Revere's ride back to Boston took longer. He fell ill for a time, fevered and weak, but refused to stop. Every mile carried the weight of a cause greater than his own comfort. And when he finally returned, gaunt and exhausted, his wife met him with tears in her eyes. "You've given everything to this fight," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Not everything yet." Months passed, and the war spread like wildfire. The colonies were alive with battle cries, some devastating. Revere's role shifted again. He was now appointed major of the Suffolk County Militia, tasked with overseeing fortifications and supply lines. It was less glamorous than his famous ride, but no less vital. He organized the transport of gunpowder, ensured troops had horses and weapons, and coordinated with ships delivering precious cargoes of saltpeter and lead. His knowledge of logistics, his meticulous nature once tools of his silversmith trade, became the backbone of military efficiency. He was no general, no celebrated warrior, but he was indispensable. And though he missed the thrill of the open road, he understood that revolutions were not won by glory, but by grit. In 1778, he was called to service again, this time at Penobscot, in what is now Maine. The mission was to repel a British incursion, but the expedition ended in disaster. Poor planning, infighting among commanders, and naval chaos left the militia stranded and defeated. Revere's reputation suffered unjustly as blame was cast in every direction. When he returned to Boston, rumors followed him, whispers that he had disobeyed orders, that he had fled the field. The weight of it cut deep. For years, he had risked his life for the cause. Now, his loyalty was questioned. But Revere did not lash out or retreat into bitterness. He sought truth, not vengeance. He demanded a court of inquiry to clear his name, and in time he was vindicated, his honor restored. He returned to his craft, to his family, to the quiet dignity of work. The war raged on. Yorktown came, and with it the long-awaited victory. When the news reached Boston, church bells rang again, louder than ever before. The colonies were free 13 sovereign states, bound not by kings, but by conviction. Revere stood in his workshop, polishing a silver teapot as the celebration thundered through the streets. He paused, listening to the joy outside, and smiled. Freedom, he thought, had not come swiftly or easily. It had come on weary horses, through icy rivers, across sleepless nights. It had come because men and women, ordinary yet unyielding, had chosen courage over comfort. Years later, when he was an old man, children would gather around him to hear the story of that midnight ride. Their eyes would widen as he described the pounding hooves, the flashing lanterns, the cry that echoed through the dark. The British are coming. But Revere always ended the tale the same way, not with pride, but with humility. I was only one voice, he'd say softly. But sometimes one voice is enough to wake a nation. He lived to see the young republic grow, to watch ships sail under a new flag, to see his city, his beloved Boston, rise from war to become a cradle of freedom. His hands, once shaping silver, had helped shape something far more lasting, the spirit of America. And though the years dimmed his strength, they could never dull the light of that night, the ride, the signal, the courage that changed the world. As age began to settle into his bones, Paul Revere often found himself awake long before dawn, listening to the quiet hum of Boston's harbor. The ships rocked gently in the distance, and the gulls cried faintly over the water. He would sit by the window, a mug of tea in his hand, and think about how much the city had changed since that night of his famous ride. Where there had once been narrow cobbled streets, lit only by lanterns, now stood thriving markets and shipyards. The clang of hammers and saws echoed from the waterfront. Boston had become not just a city of revolution, but a city of creation. And Paul Revere, restless, ever driven, was not content to simply fade into history. He had built something new, the Revere Copper Company, a foundry that turned molten metal into sheets for ships and industry. It was one of the first of its kind in America, a symbol of the nation's new independence, not just in politics, but in production. The British no longer controlled their trade, their goods, their future. America was learning to stand on its own 2 feet, and Revere was determined to be part of that foundation. Every morning, he walked through the factory floor, the smell of metal and smoke thick in the air. Workers greeted him with respect. They all knew the stories, the midnight ride, the signals, the battles, but to them, he was not just a hero of the past. He was their employer, their mentor, the man who believed that hard work and honesty could forge a stronger country. And yet, even in this new chapter of peace and prosperity, Paul carried ghosts from the past. Sometimes he dreamed of the ride hooves pounding the frozen earth, the flash of lanterns in the dark. He would wake with his heart racing, half expecting to hear the alarm bells of war once more. But those nights were gone. The danger had passed. Still, memory clung like smoke to his soul. One morning, as the harbor mist drifted inland, a young apprentice named Samuel approached him. The boy had a sharp mind and an eagerness that reminded Revere of himself decades ago. "Mr. Revere," Samuel began, holding out a small copper mold, "I can't get the curve right on this piece. It keeps warping when I press it." Revere took it in his hands, examining the flaw. His fingers, though aged, still moved with the precision of a craftsman. "You're forcing it," he said gently. "Metal has a memory, lad. You must work with it, not against it. Ease it along. Let it take shape at its own pace." Samuel frowned. "But if I go too slow, I'll fall behind." Revere smiled. "Speed wins battles, but patience wins legacies." The boy nodded, and as he returned to his station, Revere felt a flicker of warmth and echo of purpose. He realized that the revolution wasn't just fought with muskets and horses. It was fought every day, in every workshop, every classroom, every hand that built the future. As the years rolled on, visitors came often to meet the old patriot. Scholars, soldiers, and even schoolchildren would find their way to his workshop, eager to shake the hand that had once carried the warning through the night. One visitor in particular stood out a young writer from Philadelphia who was collecting first-hand accounts of the Revolution. He was polite, curious, and utterly fascinated. "Mr. Revere," he asked, notebook in hand, "when you rode that night, did you think it would become legend?" Revere chuckled, his gray beard quivering with amusement. "Legend? No. I thought I might die before dawn. But didn't you feel destiny calling?" the writer pressed. Revere looked thoughtful. "Destiny," he said slowly, "is just a word men use when they look back. That night, I wasn't thinking of destiny. I was thinking of my friends, my family, my city. I was thinking that if I didn't ride, we might lose everything. History makes heroes of ordinary men, but in the moment, we're just doing what must be done." The writer scribbled furiously, his pen scratching across the paper. When he looked up, Revere was gazing out the window again, eyes distant. "Young man," Revere said quietly, "remember, this history isn't written in ink. It's written in courage. And courage doesn't shout, it whispers." The line struck the writer deeply. Years later, when his book was published, those words became famous. "Courage doesn't shout, it whispers." They were printed beneath Revere's name, quoted in speeches, and remembered by generations. As time went on, Boston continued to grow, and so did Revere's family. His children and grandchildren often filled the house with laughter and songs. On summer evenings, they would gather in the garden, the air thick with the scent of lilacs, and beg him to tell the story just once more of the midnight ride. And every time, though he claimed to be tired of it, he would smile and begin. It was a cold April night, and the lanterns were ready. But he never told it quite the same way twice. Sometimes he focused on the fear, the unknown lurking in the dark. Other times, he spoke of the bravery of the men he rode to warn. But always, he ended with the same truth, that freedom was born not in grand speeches or glorious battles, but in quiet acts of faith. When the grandchildren grew tired and drifted to sleep, he would sit for a while, watching the stars over the harbor. Boston's lights flickered like fireflies below, and he would think about how far they had come. He remembered friends who never lived to see the Victory Warren, Adams Dawes. Their faces appeared to him in the stillness, not as ghosts, but as companions. "We did it," he would whisper into the night. "We really did it." In his final years, when his steps grew slower and his hands trembled, he remained deeply content. His country was free, his city thrived, and though history would one day exaggerate or distort the details of his famous ride, he knew the truth that he had simply done what needed to be done. One autumn afternoon, Samuel, the same apprentice who had once struggled with the copper mold, came to visit. He was now a grown man, running part of the foundry himself. "I wanted to thank you," Samuel said, "for teaching me not just about metal, but about patience, about purpose." Revere smiled, his eyes soft. "You'll teach the next one, won't you?" "I will." "Good," Revere murmured. "That's how it goes on. That's how the fire stays lit." That evening, the sun sank low over the harbor, painting the water gold. Revere sat at his window, the same place he had sat 1,000 times before, and watched the sails drifting across the horizon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the world he had helped to shape was growing, changing, moving forward. And in that quiet, as the light faded from the sky, Paul Revere, the man who once rode through darkness to awaken a nation, closed his eyes, his heart steady, his work complete. Years after Paul Revere's death, Boston had changed beyond recognition. The cobbled streets that once echoed with the thunder of his horse were now filled with the clatter of carriages and the cries of merchants selling. wares from every corner of the world. But in a small workshop near the Harvard's brick walls, faded by salt and time, the spirit of Revere still lived on. His apprentices had become masters, and their sons now stood where he once did, hammering copper and shaping the future. Samuel, the young apprentice who had once struggled with that first warped mold, was now the head of the Revere foundry. His hair had gone gray, and his hands were rough with years of work, but his eyes held the same fire that Revere had once seen in him. Every morning he would walk through the factory, touching the same workbenches where his mentor once stood, and he'd whisper quietly, still working with it, not against it. To most people in the city, Paul Revere was now a legend, a name told in school books and tavern tales. Children repeated the rhyme of his midnight ride without really knowing the man behind it. But for Samuel, Revere wasn't a legend. He was a memory, a teacher, a quiet voice that still guided him through every decision. One stormy evening, Samuel sat by the workshop window as rain streaked down the glass. Across the harbor, lightning flashed like the fire of cannon, and the wind howled through the eaves. He pulled from his drawer an old, folded letter. Revere's handwriting, faded but clear. It had been written to him many years before, when Samuel had first taken over part of the foundry. It read, "Samuel, every man must one day find the balance between fear and faith. Fear tells him what he cannot do. Faith reminds him what he must. When the hammer feels too heavy, remember the strike that shapes the metal also strengthens the hand." Samuel had read it countless times, but tonight it felt heavier. The country was growing westward expansion, new states, new industries, but it was also growing restless. The old unity of the revolution had begun to fray under the weight of politics and profit. The North and South eyed each other with suspicion. Whispers of division lingered in the air like smoke before a fire. He sighed and set the letter down. "If only Revere were here," he murmured. He'd know what to say, but deep down, he already knew what Revere would have said. Do what must be done. The next morning, Samuel visited the Old North Church, where Revere's famous signal had once shone. The church was quieter now, its pews polished and still. He walked slowly down the aisle and stopped before the altar. The air smelled faintly of wax and dust, and sunlight streamed through the high windows, painting golden stripes across the floor. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside there was only the sound of his heartbeat. Then, softly, he whispered, "One, if by land, two, if by sea." He smiled to himself. Those words had once set a nation in motion. Now they were part of history, but they still carried power. They reminded him that even the smallest act of courage could ripple through time, reaching people who might never know the name behind it. Later that week, a young woman arrived at the foundry. She wore a dark shawl and carried a notebook. "Mr. Adams," she asked shyly, "I'm writing a book about the early patriots of Boston. I hoped you might tell me about Mr. Revere." Samuel looked up from his work and smiled kindly. "I can tell you about the man," he said, "not the legend." She followed him to the office, where the old letter still sat on the desk. He poured her a cup of tea and began to speak not of battles or glory, but of Revere's laughter, his patience, his obsession with detail, his belief that freedom meant responsibility. "He didn't ride that night to become a hero," Samuel said softly. "He rode because no one else was ready. He believed someone had to act, even if no one would remember his name. The woman wrote quickly, her pen scratching furiously. "That's what people need to hear," she said. "Not just what he did, but why." Samuel nodded. "The why is always what matters." As she left, she turned back. "Do you think America still remembers what it stood for?" Samuel hesitated before answering. "We remember when we're tested," he said finally. "That's when the whisper becomes a call." The years passed, and that call would come again. By the time Samuel's own hair turned white, the nation was on the brink of civil war. The same tension that had once filled the colonies now stretched between brother and brother. And once more, ordinary men and women were asked to find courage in the dark. Through all of it, Paul Revere's name was spoken often, sometimes in classrooms, sometimes in speeches, sometimes in quiet homes, where parents told their children stories about the night a man rode through danger for the sake of freedom. But for Samuel, it was more than a name. On his final day at the foundry, he walked through the workshop one last time, the smell of metal and soot filling the air. The men stopped their work and stood in silence as he passed. At the door, he paused and turned back to them. "Remember what Mr. Revere taught us," he said. "Work with the world, not against it. Build what will outlast you. And when fear whispers, let courage answer." The men nodded solemnly. That night, as the sun set over the harbor, Samuel placed Revere's letter back in its drawer for the last time. He whispered the words one final time to the empty room. "The strike that shapes the metal also strengthens the hand." And somewhere beyond the twilight, as the waves rolled softly against the dock, it was as if the whisper of hooves could still be heard, faint, distant, eternal. The echo of a man who refused to be silent. The echo of courage itself. Decades after Samuel's passing, Boston had grown into a city of iron and steam. The ships that docked in the harbor were larger, faster, more powerful, carrying goods, not just across the Atlantic, but to faraway continents. The world was changing, modernizing at a speed that would have stunned the men of the Revolution. And yet, beneath the roar of progress, there still lingered a quiet reverence for the past, a memory of the men who had once risked everything to set the course of that future. Among those who carried that memory was Clara Adams, Samuel's granddaughter. She was a teacher at a small school near the North End, and her classroom looked out over the same cobbled streets where Paul Revere's horse had once thundered by. Every morning, she would open the windows to let in the sea breeze and tell her students stories not just of battles and kings, but of the ordinary courage that built their country. Her students, children of dock workers and craftsmen, listened wide-eyed. Most of them knew Revere only as the man from the poem they de-memorized in school. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear." But Clara told them what the poem left out. She spoke of the silversmith's steady hands, of his restless mind that never stopped creating, of the night he rode not for glory, but for duty. "Remember," she'd say softly, "Paul Revere wasn't trying to become famous. He was trying to make sure people were safe." Her lessons always ended the same way, with her gaze drifting out the window toward the harbor's edge, as if she could still see that lone rider disappearing into the fog. One rainy afternoon, after class had ended, a knock came at her door. A tall man in a dark coat entered, his hat dripping with rain. "Miss Adams?" he asked. "My name is Henry Lowell. I'm writing a book about Boston's role in the Revolution. I heard you're the great-granddaughter of Samuel Adams, the apprentice of Paul Revere." She nodded modestly. "That's true. He taught my grandfather the trade." And my father passed down his stories. They've been in our family for generations. Henry smiled. Then you may be the last person in Boston who still remembers him as a man and not just a myth. Clara motioned for him to sit. She poured 2 cups of tea and began to speak not from notes but from memory. She described how Revere would whistle softly while he worked, how he always paused before striking the first hammer blow, how he believed that every creation, no matter how small, carried a moral weight. History likes its heroes loud, she said, her eyes bright. But Paul Revere was quiet. His courage was quiet. That's what makes him different. Henry scribbled furiously, capturing every word. When she finished, he asked, "Do you think he knew what his ride would mean?" Clara smiled faintly. He didn't need to. The right thing doesn't need an audience. It just needs someone willing to do it. Would you let me quote you? "Only if you promise one thing," she replied. "Don't turn him into a statue. Let him remain human. Let people know that courage can live in anyone." He nodded. "I promise." Months later, when Henry's book was published, one chapter stood out above all others. It wasn't about the battles, or the generals, or the politics. It was about the man who rode in silence. Readers across America were moved by it. Newspapers reprinted Clara's quote about quiet courage, and soon schools everywhere began teaching not just the famous poem, but also the deeper story behind it. Years turned into decades. The world changed. Again, factories boomed, telegraphs buzzed, locomotives screamed across the countryside. But in Boston, the old North Church still stood, its spire reaching skyward, and on quiet nights, the city seemed to hold its breath, remembering. Clara grew older, her hair silvered, her step slowed, but she never stopped teaching. Even as her eyesight faded, she continued to tell the story to new generations. One spring evening, after her final class of the term, she walked to Cope's Hill Cemetery, where both Revere and her grandfather were buried. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of blooming lilacs. She laid a small sprig of copper at Revere's headstone metal from the very foundry he had built. "Mr. Revere," she whispered, "we're still listening." As she turned to leave, a gust of wind swept across the harbor, rustling through the grass. It carried with it the faint sound of distant hooves. Imagination, perhaps, or memory, but Clara smiled anyway. She didn't need proof. She knew that history's echoes never truly fade. Years later, long after Clara herself was gone, her story and Revere's came intertwined in the fabric of America's mythos. Writers, filmmakers, and artists reimagined the midnight ride, each adding new color to the legend. Some made it grand and heroic, others mysterious and haunting. But beneath every retelling, one truth endured, that a single man's decision, made in the dark, had changed the course of a nation. In the early 20th century, when electric lights replaced lanterns and cars replaced horses, a historian named Dr. William Prescott visited the old Revere home, now a small museum. He walked through the narrow rooms, touching the worn wood, the polished silver, the tools that still bore the marks of use. Standing by the window, he gazed down at the street below, and tried to imagine that night, the clatter of hooves, the flicker of lanterns, the urgency of a man racing against time. He felt something stir deep within him, not just admiration, but responsibility. It was one thing to remember history, he realized, but another to carry it forward. He wrote in his journal that evening, "Revere's story is not about one man's ride, but about what happens when conscience refuses to sleep." That line, when published, struck a chord across America. It reminded a new generation born into modernity and ease that freedom had been bought by those who dared to act when others hesitated. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. Veterans carried it in letters home. And so, through the decades, through changing times and shifting ideals, Paul Revere remained more than just a figure in a poem. He became a symbol not of loud defiance, but of the quiet courage that lives inside ordinary people when history demands something extraordinary. Even now, as the city lights of modern Boston gleam against the harbor, the past feels near on misty nights when the wind sweeps through the narrow alleys of the North End. Some say you can still hear the echo of hooves, the whisper of a warning carried on the air. Perhaps it's only imagination, or perhaps it's something more, the enduring voice of a man who believed that freedom must always be protected, even in the quiet hours before dawn. By the mid-20th century, the story of Paul Revere's Ride had become part of America's collective soul. Every schoolchild could recite the lines from Longfellow's poem. Every history textbook carried his name. Yet, for many, it had become more myth than memoria, shining symbol, polished and simplified for comfort. Few stopped to think about what it had truly meant to ride into the darkness, unsure if dawn would ever come. One of those few was Thomas Hale, a young historian teaching at Harvard in the 1950s. He was fascinated not by battles or leaders, but by the quieter figures of the Revolution, the printers, the smiths, the messengers who risked their lives for causes greater than themselves. When he stumbled upon Clara Adams' old correspondence in a library archive, letters written in neat cursive about her ancestor Samuel and Mr. Revere, he became obsessed. These people weren't just names, he wrote in his notebook. They felt the cold, they feared failure, and yet they rode anyway. Thomas began visiting the Old North Church every Sunday morning, sitting quietly in the back pew. He wasn't religious, but he found peace there. The worn wood, the scent of candle wax, the narrow beams that had once framed the famous lanterns, it all whispered to him. One afternoon, he met an elderly caretaker polishing the brass candle holders. "You come here often," the man said with a chuckle. Thomas smiled. "I like to imagine what it must have been like that night, the fear, the uncertainty." The caretaker nodded knowingly. Most folks remember the light in the steeple. Few remember the darkness that came before it. That sentence stayed with Thomas. It became the opening line of his next book, Before the Light in the Steeple. The book was different from any previous telling. It wasn't just about the famous ride, it was about the people who stayed behind. The wives who watched from their windows, the children who didn't understand why their fathers whispered late at night. It told of the fear of the unknown, the sound of British boots echoing in narrow streets, and the fragile courage that held the city together. When the book was published in 1958, it quietly became a sensation. Veterans returning from Korea wrote to Thomas, saying they understood now that courage wasn't about victory, was about showing up, even when you didn't know if it would matter. Teachers used the book to inspire students, and for a while, history felt alive, again not as a series of facts, but as a living, breathing echo of the human spirit. Years passed. Thomas grew older, his beard silver, his lectures slower but richer. Every year on April 18th, the anniversary of Revere's Ride, he would stand on the steps of the Old North Church and read aloud from his book to anyone who cared to listen. Rain or shine, people came. Children sat cross-legged on the cobblestones, and old veterans stood with their hats over their hearts. And when he came to that famous line, most folks remember the light in the steeple. Few remember the darkness that came before it. There would always be silence, a heavy, reverent silence that spoke louder than applause ever could. Then, one spring evening in 1975, the 200th anniversary of the ride, Boston prepared for its grandest commemoration yet. The city had planned parades, reenactments, even fireworks over the harbor. Thousands gathered near the church, their faces illuminated by lantern light. Thomas, now frail and in his 70s, was given the honor of speaking. As he walked to the podium, the crowd hushed. Behind him, 2 lanterns glowed faintly in the church steeple, just as they had 2 centuries before. He began softly, his voice raspy but steady. 200 years ago tonight, a man rode into the darkness, not to seek glory, but to give warning. He didn't know if anyone would listen. He didn't know if the message would reach its mark, but he rode anyway. The crowd leaned in closer, the wind carrying his words across the square. Paul Revere's courage, he continued, wasn't in the ride itself, it was in the choice to ride. That's the kind of courage we still need. The courage to act when the world grows dark, to speak when silence feels safer. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. People weren't just hearing history, they were feeling it. When the ceremony ended, Thomas stood for a long moment beneath the church's shadow. The bells tolled softly, echoing through the crisp night air. In the distance, along the harbor, the modern skyline shimmered with electric light. He smiled faintly. "We've come a long way, Mr. Revere," he whispered to the night, "but we're still listening." That night, as the fireworks burst above the harbor, their reflections danced across the water like phantom lanterns. And somewhere, deep in Boston's old heartbeat, the story lived untouched by time. 50 years later, the world was a different place. Screens had replaced pages, voices had become digital, and stories once told by candlelight now flickered across glowing devices. Yet even in that world, history found a way to whisper. A young woman named Emily Carter, a filmmaker from Maine, stumbled upon an old copy of Before the Light in the steeple in a thrift store. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked, but something about the title caught her heart. She read it that night in one sitting, unable to put it down. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She would make a film, not the grand, battle-filled kind Hollywood loved, but a quiet, intimate story about the man behind the myth, about Paul Revere's humanity, the fear, the resolve, the love of home. It took her 5 years. She filmed on location in Boston, casting a modest theater actor as Revere. The scenes were simple: the candlelight on his workbench, the nervous glance at the clock before his ride, the whisper to his wife before leaving, "If I don't return, tell them I rode for them." When the film premiered at an indie festival in Vermont, audiences wept. Critics called it a haunting meditation on ordinary courage. Netflix later picked it up, and soon millions across the world watched. Teenagers, soldiers, nurses, teachers, all found something of themselves in that quiet rider. The film ended with a single line on the screen, taken from Thomas Hale's book. Most folks remember the light in the steeple. Few remember the darkness that came before it. That line spread across social media, quoted by people who'd never even heard of Longfellow. Hashtags like #RideThroughTheDark and #QuietCourage trended for weeks. Emily received thousands of letters and emails from viewers saying how the film gave them strength, how they defaced fears, loss, or doubt, but found hope in the idea that even the smallest act of bravery could ripple across time. And somewhere, perhaps smiling from the quiet halls of memory, Paul Revere's legacy pulsed again alive, enduring, whispering through the centuries. For in every age there comes a night of darkness, and in every age someone must ride. The film Before the Light in the Steeple had become more than just a success. It had become a quiet movement. Across small towns and big cities alike, classrooms began showing it during history lessons. Veterans groups screened it at community centers. Even some pastors used it as a metaphor in sermons about moral courage, conscience, and the light that guides us through doubt. But for Emily Carter, the filmmaker, the real story began after the fame. A few months after the movie's release, she received a handwritten letter, not an email, not a typed message, but an old-fashioned letter sealed in wax. Inside, the writer introduced himself simply. "My name is Henry Hale, grandson of Professor Thomas Hale, author of the book that inspired your film." Emily froze as she read. Henry wrote about how his grandfather had passed away in 1984, long before the internet, long before his story reached millions. He enclosed a photograph of Thomas standing beneath the Old North Church lanterns during the bicentennial celebration, eyes bright even in old age. But there was more. Henry mentioned that before his death, Thomas had written an unpublished essay, The Last Ride of Memory, a deeply personal reflection on how history repeats itself in the hearts of those willing to listen. He had never sent it to any publisher. Henry had found it sealed in a wooden box marked simply, "For the next storyteller, I think that storyteller," Henry wrote, "might be you." Emily sat for a long while, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. Outside her window, the late autumn rain streaked against the glass, each drop illuminated by city lights like tiny lanterns. She didn't know it yet, but that letter would change the direction of her life and bring Paul Revere's whisper into a new century. Weeks later, Emily met Henry in Boston. He was in his early 70s, gentle-faced with a quiet humor that reminded her of her late grandfather. Over tea at a small cafe near Faneuil Hall, he slid the wooden box across the table. It was old, smooth, and carved with faint initials, TH. When Emily opened it, she found not only the essay, but also several loose pages, sketches of lanterns, maps of Revere's route, and notes written in the margins of history books. But one particular line, scribbled in faded ink, caught her eye. "Courage is not born from certainty. It grows in the soil of doubt." She whispered the words aloud, and Henry smiled softly. "That's how he lived," he said, "always believing that even questions could be sacred." That night, Emily stayed in a small inn overlooking the Charles River. She read the essay from start to finish in a single sitting. Thomas's words carried the rhythm of a confession, the tone of a man who had looked too long into the past and found it staring back. He wrote of walking the same cobblestone streets Revere once did, of hearing echoes in the church bells, of feeling that the ride never really ended, that every generation, in its own way, must ride again. In one haunting paragraph, he wrote, "Perhaps the truest revolution is not of muskets and banners, but of conscience. A people who lose the courage to question have already lost the liberty to speak." Revere's lanterns were not just signals to patriots, they were promises to posterity. By the time she reached the final page, Emily was in tears. She realized that her film, though beautiful, had only touched the surface. The deeper truth lay here, in the quiet persistence of moral courage that outlives the writer, the war, even the nation itself. The next morning, she called her producer and said simply, "We're not done yet." Her next project became a documentary, The Last Ride of Memory, weaving together Thomas Hale's writings, interviews with historians, and modern voices who had drawn strength from the old story. But Emily didn't stop there. She traveled to Concord, to Lexington, to Boston's narrow lanes, recording dawn light over the same paths Revere had once ridden. She used an old microphone, the kind with a soft analog hiss, to record the wind between the gravestones, the tolling bells, the sound of horses from reenactments. "Let's make the past breathe again," she told her sound engineer. One night, while filming at the Old North Church, the power unexpectedly went out. The crew fell silent in the pitch darkness. Then, one of the staff climbed to the balcony and lit 2 lanterns, purely out of instinct. The old light filled the space in a soft, golden glow. No one spoke. Emily whispered to herself, "It's never really gone out, has it?" When they reviewed the footage later, the moment was breathtaking. The flickering light, the shadowed pews, the quiet awe on everyone's faces. That unplanned moment became the documentary's opening scene. When The Last Ride of Memory premiered on PBS, it didn't trend like her first film, but it didn't need to. It resonated deeper. Older viewers wrote in to say it made them remember who they used to be. Teachers began pairing it with lessons on ethics, not just history. And quietly, donations began to flow to the preservation of historic sites connected to Revere's route. Henry Hale watched the premiere from his home in Boston, tears glistening in his eyes. "Grandfather," he whispered, "the story's still riding." By the time Emily was invited to speak at the Smithsonian, the story of Paul Revere had evolved once again, not as a tale of rebellion, but as a meditation on endurance. Standing before the audience, Emily said softly, "Revere's courage was never loud, it was whispered. It didn't come from certainty, it came from love. Love for a place, for people, for the fragile promise of dawn." A hush fell over the room. She smiled faintly and added, "And maybe that's what all of us need to remember, that courage, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply rides quietly through the night." The audience rose in a standing ovation, and as Emily stepped down from the stage, she noticed a small boy in the front row holding a miniature lantern his father had made for him. The boy waved shyly and said, "Miss Carter, my dad says we have to keep the light going." Emily knelt beside him and smiled. "Your dad's right. Just promise me one thing. If the world ever gets too dark, light it again." The boy nodded solemnly. As she walked outside into the crisp Washington night, Emily looked up at the stars above the Potomac, faint, cold, and eternal. Somewhere in that quiet sky, she imagined Paul Revere's horse galloping still, carrying not just a warning, but a reminder. The ride never ends. Months after her Smithsonian speech, Emily Carter retreated to her cabin in Vermont. She had been invited to write a book expanding on the legacy of Paul Revere, but she wasn't sure she had anything new left to say. The fire crackled softly in the old stone hearth as she stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. The wind outside howled through the pines, long, cold breaths echoing like distant whispers of riders in the dark. She thought of Henry Hale, of his grandfather's words, and of how real stories never truly ended. They just passed from hand to hand, like torches in a night too deep to cross alone. But tonight, her thoughts weren't on fame or legacy, or even Revere himself. They were on the weight of silence, the silence that followed every revolution, every battle, every act of courage. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, a local mailman handed her a small envelope. The sender's name made her heart skip. Boston Historical Society. Inside was a simple note. We recently uncovered new materials from the archives of the Revere family. You might want to see this. 2 days later, she drove through light snow to Boston, her car tires crunching over frozen streets. Inside the archive room, a curator greeted her with quiet excitement. On a large table sat a thin, leather-bound journal. This, he said, belonged to Joseph Warren, one of the men Revere warned that fateful night. Emily's pulse quickened. Warren, the doctor-turned-revolutionary, had died at Bunker Hill. His writings were rare. She slipped on the white gloves the curator handed her and opened the first page. It wasn't a diary, exactly, more like scattered thoughts, letters never sent. But among them, a single passage stood out. Revere rode not for glory, but for grief. He feared what might come if men slept too long in comfort. That line hit Emily like a bell tolling across centuries. She whispered it aloud. He rode not for glory, but for grief. In that instant, everything connected. Hale's essays, the ride, the lanterns, her own search for meaning. Maybe that was the hidden core of the story all along. Courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about loving something enough to fear for it. She requested permission to use Warren's writings in her book, and after weeks of negotiation, the society agreed. But the more she read, the more personal her project became. She found herself writing not just about history, but about her own father, a firefighter who died when she was young, running into burning buildings, not because he was fearless, but because he couldn't bear not to try. That spring, Emily titled her manuscript, Riding Through the Silence. It wasn't TA, biography, or a history book. It was something between a memoir and a meditation. She poured her heart into every page, weaving Revere's midnight courage with the quiet bravery of ordinary people she'd met over the years. A single mother who went back to college at 50, a veteran who planted trees for peace, a teacher who stayed in an underfunded school because he believed in one child's potential. When she finished the last chapter, she sat for a long while staring at the screen. Outside, the snow had melted into soft mud, and the first shoots of spring grass pushed through. She smiled to herself, whispering, "Maybe the ride never ends because it keeps finding new riders." The book released that summer to quiet but steady acclaim. Critics called it profoundly human, and as gentle as it is, revolutionary. Emily didn't expect it to become a bestseller yet. Within months, it climbed to the top of several nonfiction lists. But what mattered most were the letters she received. A woman from Maine wrote, "Your story made me pick up my brush again after 20 years. I realized the lantern isn't out. I just forgot how to light it." A truck driver from Ohio emailed, "I listened to your audiobook every night on the road. Made me feel like I was part of something bigger again." Even schoolchildren sent drawings of lanterns, riders, and stars. Emily began to feel as though Revere's horse had never really stopped galloping. It had just changed forms, from hoofbeats to heartbeats. One evening, she returned to Boston to meet Henry Hale again. He was frailer now, walking with a cane, but his eyes sparkled as always. They met near the Charles River, where the bridge lights shimmered like reflections of Revere's lanterns. "I read your book," Henry said, voice trembling slightly. "My grandfather would have been proud. He always believed the truest historians were the ones who could still feel wonder." Emily smiled. "I think your grandfather was the last writer of his time, and maybe now it's our turn." They sat in silence for a while, watching boats drift under the night sky. Henry reached into his coat pocket and handed her something wrapped in cloth. "Found this while going through his belongings again," he said. Inside was a small, tarnished silver pendant shaped like a horse mid-gallop, its mane like flowing flame. On the back, engraved words read, "For those who keep the light." Emily traced the engraving with her thumb. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours now," Henry said softly. He made it for whoever would tell the story next. She looked at him, overcome. "Then I'll wear it every time I tell it." Months passed. The world kept moving faster. New headlines, new crises, new distractions. But Emily kept riding the same trail in her own way, traveling across the country, giving talks about courage, empathy, and the forgotten art of listening to history's whispers. In one small town in Virginia, an old man approached her after a lecture. "Ma'am," he said, "I fought in Korea, lost some good friends there, haven't talked about it in decades. But when you spoke about Revere, it reminded me, maybe courage ain't about what we fight for. Maybe it's about what we refuse to forget." She took his hand and nodded. "Exactly," she said softly. "That's what keeps the light alive." Afterward, she stood alone in the empty hall, the echo of applause fading. She looked up at the ceiling, lights bright, modern, and cold, and imagined replacing them with old lanterns. Somewhere deep inside, she heard it again, the soft clatter of hooves, the whisper of wind through the streets of 1775, and a voice calling not for war, but for awakening. "The British are coming" had become, across the centuries, a metaphor, not for an enemy, but for complacency, for sleep, for forgetting what it means to care enough to act. Emily realized that was Revere's true warning all along. Not that danger approaches from the outside, but that apathy grows from within. She smiled faintly, whispering into the empty room, "I hear you, Paul," loud and clear. And as she stepped outside, the evening breeze brushed her face like a nod from history itself, a quiet affirmation that the ride indeed continues. Autumn returned to Boston, crisp and golden. When Emily Carter was invited to participate in a special event, the 250th anniversary of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, the city planned a candlelit reenactment that would stretch from the Old North Church all the way to Lexington Green. For Emily, it felt like the culmination of everything she'd spent the last few years chasing, a living echo of a man's courage reborn in a modern age. She stood in the church courtyard as dusk fell, watching volunteers dress in colonial garb. The old steeple loomed above, its bricks catching the last rays of sun like embers in twilight. People were quiet, respectful, almost reverent. Somewhere, a flute began to play a mournful melody. A local historian approached her, Dr. Michael Avery, a lean man in his 60s who had spent decades studying Revere's life. "You know," he said softly, "people always talk about that one ride. But Revere's real gift wasn't what he did that night. It was what he believed every night before, that ordinary people could matter." Emily smiled. "That's the part we forget to teach." "Exactly," Avery nodded. "He didn't just wake up brave. He practiced it quietly, every day, by showing up, by staying informed, by refusing to let fear shrink his sense of duty. As the church bells began to ring, Emily's heart swelled. The lanterns were lifted high, 2 of them, just as they had been in 1775, their soft glow spilling across the courtyard. Hundreds of people watched in silence, their faces illuminated by that ancient light, and for a moment time folded in on itself. Later that evening, the reenactment began. A rider mounted his horse, costumed as Paul Revere himself, and took off through the narrow cobblestone streets. Spectators followed on foot, some carrying candles, others humming quietly. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, wide-eyed, while tourists recorded the event on their phones, the old and the new colliding in a strange but beautiful harmony. Emily walked beside Dr. Avery, her breath visible in the cold air. "You ever think," she asked, "what Revere would make of all this? All the noise, the lights, the screens?" Avery chuckled. "He'd probably think we've built a faster horse. The question is whether we're still riding toward freedom or away from it." That line stayed with her. As the parade reached Cambridge, the rider slowed his horse. The crowd gathered around a temporary stage where a young actor began to recite from Longfellow's poem. His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." But halfway through, something unexpected happened. The power for the stage lights flickered and went out completely. Darkness swept across the crowd. A murmur of confusion rippled through the air. Then, slowly, one by one, people lifted their candles higher, dozens, then hundreds, until the entire field glowed with living firelight. The actor didn't stop. He kept reciting by heart, his words carried by wind and human breath. And in that light, Emily saw faces, young and old, black and white, strangers united not by spectacle, but by remembrance. "It was perfect," she whispered to herself. "This is what he rode for." The next morning, Emily sat in a cafe overlooking the Charles River, notebook open, coffee steaming beside her. She couldn't stop thinking about the night before. Not the poetry or the performance, but the moment the lights went out, that brief, breathless silence when people chose to lift their own light. She began to write. History isn't something that happens to us. It's something we keep alive every time we refuse to let the dark win. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her editor. "Your last article went viral, -4 million views in 24 hours. The Washington Post wants to syndicate your next one." Emily smiled, humbled. She didn't chase numbers anymore. What mattered was resonance, the kind that stirred people awake. Over the next few weeks, she traveled to schools and libraries across the country, giving talks about everyday courage. She told stories of quiet bravery, not just Revere's, but of nurses during the pandemic, firefighters in California, and small-town teachers who taught history by candlelight when power outages hit. Her talks always ended with one sentence: "The lanterns still burn, but now they hang inside us." During one of those talks in Concord, a teenage boy raised his hand. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "you talk a lot about light. But what if someone's light goes out? What if they can't find it again?" The room fell silent. Emily took a deep breath. "That's a brave question," she said softly. "Sometimes our light doesn't go out. It just hides behind fear, or exhaustion, or heartbreak. The trick isn't to look for it, it's to listen for it. Because the light has a voice. It whispers, try again." The boy nodded slowly. Later, as the audience dispersed, he came up to her with tears in his eyes and said, "Thank you. I needed to hear that." After he left, Emily sat alone for a while, thinking about how history was made, not just by riders, but by listeners, the ones who paused, who heard the call, who decided to move even when the night seemed endless. One cold December night, Emily returned to the Old North Church one last time. Snow dusted the roof, and the steeple's bell glowed faintly in the moonlight. She carried with her a single lantern, small brass, and flickering softly in the wind. Inside the empty sanctuary, she walked down the aisle and placed it at the foot of the pulpit. Then she whispered, "For those who keep the light." Her words echoed gently, and she thought of everyone who'd come before: Revere, Warren, Hale, her father, Henry, and countless nameless souls who had faced fear with quiet resolve. She sat in the front pew, letting the silence envelop her. The only sound was the low hiss of the flame. At that moment, she understood something profound. History wasn't a chain of events, it was a pulse, and courage was its heartbeat. She closed her eyes and smiled. The church bell struck midnight. Outside, snow began to fall, each flake catching the faint glow of lantern light, 1,000 tiny echoes of a ride that had never truly ended. Spring returned to Boston with a timid warmth, melting the last patches of snow and revealing the streets Revere had ridden centuries ago. Emily Carter walked along those cobblestones one early morning, notebook in hand, reflecting on how far the story had traveled, not just geographically, but through hearts and minds. It had grown beyond a single midnight, beyond a famous poem, and even beyond her films and books. It had become a living lesson in courage, persistence, and human connection. She paused outside a small brick house near the north end. A plaque indicated that this had once been the home of a merchant who had helped Revere on his ride, providing horses and messages. Emily smiled softly, imagining the quiet nights when candlelight cut through the mist, when ordinary citizens held their breath as they decided whether to act, to risk, to trust. Inside, she found a local historian arranging artifacts. Among them were letters exchanged between Revere and various patriot leaders, some frantic, some casual, some tender. One in particular caught her attention, written in 1775. "Moments after his ride, I fear that what I do tonight may not suffice. Yet I must ride, not because I am brave, but because someone must." Emily read the line aloud, letting the words linger. The courage in that admission was profound. It wasn't born from confidence. It was born from responsibility, from a recognition that inaction was a far greater danger than fear itself. That day, Emily visited a nearby school. She had been invited to speak to a group of students about courage in everyday life. The classroom buzzed with the energy of curiosity, a mix of skepticism and fascination. She began her talk with a simple question: "Have you ever been afraid to do what you knew was right?" Hands shot up, shy, hesitant, or determined. Emily listened as one student described standing up for a friend being bullied. Another spoke of advocating for climate action in a town resistant to change. And yet another talked about learning to tell the truth to a parent after a difficult mistake. "These are your rides," Emily said gently. "Not all of us can gallop through the night with muskets or warnings, but the courage you show in your own life, quiet, persistent, and real, keeps the light alive." A boy in the back raised his hand. "But what if nobody notices? What if it doesn't make a difference?" Emily smiled, recalling Thomas Hale's words about the darkness before the light. Then you've already won, she replied, because courage isn't measured by recognition. It's measured by action. The students were silent for a moment, letting the idea sink in, and then, slowly, a few nodded. Others scribbled in notebooks, and one girl whispered, "I think I understand now." Later that evening, Emily returned to her cabin, exhausted but inspired. She sat by the window, pen in hand, and began to write letters, not professional letters, not emails, but handwritten notes to those who had shared their stories with her. Teachers, veterans, students, even strangers who had sent drawings or messages inspired by her work. "Your courage matters," she wrote in one letter. "Even when the night is long and the world seems indifferent, it matters. Thank you for keeping the light alive." She sealed the envelopes and placed them in a basket. The wind rustled the pines outside, carrying the sound of leaves and distant birdsong. It felt as though the world itself was listening. Weeks later, Emily was invited to give a keynote speech at a conference for history educators in Philadelphia. Standing at the podium, she addressed hundreds of teachers. "History is often taught as a series of dates and facts," she began. "But the truth is, history is made of decisions. Every revolution, every act of courage, every warning in the night came from ordinary people choosing to act despite fear." She shared the story of Revere's ride, of the letters and journals she had discovered, of Thomas Hale and Henry Hale, and of the countless voices that had whispered across time. She emphasized the importance of teaching history as living memory, as a tool for empathy and action rather than mere memorization. A teacher in the audience asked, "How do we inspire students to see courage in their own lives?" Emily smiled. "By showing them that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's standing by your friend, telling the truth, or simply refusing to look away. By highlighting stories of quiet bravery, you help them see that history is not distant, it is within them." After the conference, she received letters and messages from educators around the country. They wrote of students inspired to take action in their communities, to advocate for the marginalized, and to embrace responsibility for the world around them. Emily realized that the ride had found new horses, new riders, in ways she could never have imagined. One rainy evening in Boston, Emily walked alone along the harbor. The lights of the city reflected on the water, shimmering like lanterns in the dark. She thought about the thousands who had ridden, written, spoken, or simply listened over the centuries. Courage was alive, she realized, not because of one man, but because of the countless people who responded when called. A small boat drifted near the docks, its lantern flickering. Emily paused and watched. For a moment, she imagined the ride itself, Revere cutting through fog and fear, the town sleeping, the weight of responsibility pressing against him. And she understood deeply that the story of courage was endless. It wasn't a single night, a single ride, or a single person. It was a continuum, a shared legacy of action over fear, of light in the dark. She returned to her cabin, lit a candle, and opened her journal. She wrote page after page about ordinary courage, the kind that doesn't make headlines but shapes lives. She wrote about people she'd met, stories she'd heard, and the lessons she hoped to pass on. Outside, the city murmured softly, the night alive with unseen echoes, and Emily Carter, like all those who had come before her, continued to ride, not on horseback, not through cobblestone streets, but through words, memory, and the quiet act of remembrance. The lanterns, she thought, are never truly gone. Summer approached, bringing warmth and long, golden evenings that stretched over Boston's historic streets. Emily Carter spent her days traveling between small towns, libraries, and historical societies, continuing her exploration of Paul Revere's legacy. She noticed something remarkable. Everywhere she went, the story seemed to take on a life of its own. Lanterns, once a simple symbol of warning, had become a metaphor for resilience, vigilance, and the quiet power of ordinary people acting with conscience. In a small town in Massachusetts, Emily visited an elementary school where students had recreated Revere's ride in the playground. Children ran with handmade lanterns, calling out in echoes of the past. Teachers explained the importance of the ride, not as a spectacle, but as a lesson in civic responsibility. Emily watched the scene, tears pricking her eyes. The lanterns flickered in the late afternoon sun, small lights in tiny hands, proof that courage and history could be passed down in tangible ways. A local teacher approached her, smiling. "We started a project after reading your book," she said. Each student wrote a letter to someone in their community, a neighbor, a firefighter, a relative, about what courage meant to them. Then they delivered the letters. The response was overwhelming. Emily nodded, moved. "That's exactly what it's about," she said softly. "Not just knowing history, but living it." Later that week, Emily returned to Boston to meet with Henry Hale. He had grown older, slower, and yet his eyes remained bright with the same warmth and curiosity she remembered. They walked through the North End, past the Old North Church, and along the narrow streets that had witnessed centuries of history. "I think your work has done more than I could have imagined," Henry said. "Grandfather would be proud. You've taken his essay, my letters, and all these fragments of history, and made them breathe again." Emily smiled. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "It's all of us. Every teacher, every student, every person who took the story to heart." Revere's ride was never about one man. It was about the ripple effect, and it's still rippling. They paused near the river, where the evening sun cast a golden path across the water. Henry reached into his coat and handed Emily a small bundle. Inside was a set of old lantern sketches, maps, and notes from Thomas Hale's unpublished writings, materials that had never been shared publicly. Emily traced the inked lines with her fingers. "This is incredible," she whispered. "It's like discovering the heartbeat of the story itself." Henry nodded. "And now it's in your hands. Tell it well." That summer, Emily organized a traveling exhibition, taking artifacts, letters, and journals from Boston to New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. The exhibition was not flashy. It was quiet, contemplative, and immersive. Visitors could touch facsimiles of the letters, hear readings of Thomas Hale's essays, and even see reenactments of the ride projected against the walls. The goal wasn't to impress, but to awaken, to remind people that history was, in T, just a series of events in the past. It was alive in the choices made every day. Parents brought children, students came on field trips, even tourists stopped to listen and reflect. Emily watched a group of teenagers gather around a projection of Revere's route. One boy pointed to a lantern flickering on the wall. "That's him, right?" he asked, wide-eyed. "Yes," Emily said softly. "But also, it's you, and anyone who chooses to act, to care, to keep the light burning." The boy nodded slowly, a quiet understanding settling across his face. Emily felt a familiar warmth in her chest. the same feeling she had felt years ago when holding Henry Hale's letter for the first time. The story had moved from history into human hearts, and that was all that truly mattered. In the evenings, Emily often returned to her cabin in Vermont, where she wrote her reflections, letters, and essays inspired by her travels. She began keeping a new journal, one not for publication, but for personal meditation. It contained notes on courage in modern life, observations about people who embodied the spirit of Revere without ever knowing it, and even sketches of lanterns glowing in the moonlight. One night, she opened a letter she had received from a veteran in Ohio. It read, "I served my country in silence for years, never seeking recognition. Your work reminded me that courage is not measured in medals, but in the quiet persistence to do what's right. Thank you for keeping the light alive." Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it on her desk. She whispered to herself, "Every act counts. Every voice matters." Her work began to draw attention from media outlets, not as sensational news, but as a story of inspiration. Podcasts interviewed her about the modern implications of Revere's ride. Radio hosts discussed how courage could manifest in small, everyday ways, and quietly in libraries and schools across the country. Students and teachers were taking note, carrying the lessons into homes, communities, and classrooms. Emily realized that the story had transcended her films and books. It had become a living dialogue between generations, between past and present, between history and conscience. She understood that the true measure of success was not fame or accolades, but the awakening of awareness and action in ordinary people. One quiet evening, she returned to the Old North Church once more. The city was hushed, the streets empty. She carried a small candle and lit it in front of the pulpit, tracing her fingers along the brass handle of the lantern. She closed her eyes, imagining Revere riding through the night, imagining the countless unseen riders who had carried courage forward in their own ways. She whispered, "For those who keep the light." The flame flickered, casting shadows on the old bricks. Emily smiled, feeling the pulse of history beneath her fingertips, a rhythm of bravery, persistence, and hope. Outside, the stars shone faintly, as if acknowledging that the ride, indeed, never ended. As she left the church, Emily knew that the lanterns were not only in the past, they were carried forward by every person choosing to act with conscience, to speak when silence was easier, and to light the darkness in whatever way they could. And in that quiet realization, Emily Carter felt the full weight and wonder of the story she had dedicated her life to sharing. A story that had begun on a single midnight, but would continue as long as people remembered, listened, and rode forward with courage. By late summer, Emily Carter had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her travels. Each lecture, each exhibition, each quiet conversation about courage reinforced what she had come to believe, that history was not a static record of dates and names, but a living network of choices and consequences echoing across generations. Paul Revere's Ride was no longer merely a story of midnight gallop and lanterns. It had become a symbol for vigilance, responsibility, and the enduring power of ordinary people acting with conviction. In Providence, Rhode Island, Emily visited a community center where a program had been established to teach young people about local history through active participation. Students had taken it upon themselves to reconstruct the events of 1775, assigning roles, tracing the routes on maps, and even hosting nightly lantern watch exercises in the town square. Emily watched a group of students, ages 12 to 15, whispering to one another in hushed tones, carefully carrying small lanterns along the cobblestones. One of the boys, wearing a paper tricorn hat, stopped mid-step and looked at her. "Are we doing it right?" he asked earnestly. "You're doing more than right," Emily replied, her voice steady but soft. "You're listening, and listening is how courage begins." A girl next to him added, "We read your book, Ms. Carter. It made us realize it's not just about the ride, it's about what comes after, about what we do when nobody's watching." Emily nodded, deeply moved. That was the very essence of Revere's message. Courage was NT, measured by applause or recognition, but by the quiet choices that ripple out, unseen, shaping the world in subtle but profound ways. That evening, she returned to her hotel room overlooking the Providence River, where the water reflected the amber glow of city lights. She opened her laptop and began writing a new essay, one she had been carrying in her mind for months. The Continuum of Courage. She wrote about the thousands of unnoticed acts that had kept the flame of freedom alive since the 18th century. The mill workers who defied exploitation, the teachers who stayed in struggling schools, the nurses and doctors who risked everything during crises, and the everyday citizens who dared to speak truth to power. Each story was a lantern, each choice a thread in the larger tapestry of history. Emily paused to read a passage from one of Thomas Hale's letters she had carried with her for years. "The night may be long, the road uncertain, but the heart that listens and acts will always find the way." She let the words sink in, realizing that her own journey had mirrored that principle. She had listened, she had acted, and in doing so, she had helped others to see the light they carried within themselves. In the weeks that followed, Emily's work gained increasing attention. An invitation arrived from the Massachusetts Historical Society to speak at their annual gala. The event promised a gathering of scholars, politicians, and citizens who had a vested interest in preserving and promoting historical awareness. Emily agreed, understanding that it would be both an opportunity to reach new audiences and a chance to reconnect with historians whose work she deeply respected. On the night of the gala, the hall was decorated with subtle nods to Revere's era lanterns suspended from the ceiling, vintage maps on the walls, and carefully preserved replicas of colonial artifacts displayed throughout. Emily gave her talk, weaving together her discoveries, reflections, and the countless stories of modern courage she had encountered. She emphasized the continuity between past and present, urging attendees to recognize that history was not a distant echo, but a call to action that persisted through every generation. After the talk, a woman approached her, tears in her eyes. "Your words reminded me of my father," she said. "He never spoke of his time in the military, but he made sure my siblings and I knew the importance of acting even when it's hard. You've shown me that his lessons weren't just family values. They were part of a much larger story." Emily smiled. "Exactly. Courage isn't just personal, it's communal. Every act contributes to a larger chain, a legacy of light carried forward." One day, during a rare pause in her travels, Emily returned to her Vermont cabin, seeking solitude and reflection. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth after a brief summer rain. She lit a lantern in the window and sat at her desk, reviewing letters and journal entries she had collected over the past year. She realized that the ride had become more than a historical event. It had become a lens through which she understood human resilience. She wrote in her journal, Courage is not always a roar. Often, it is a whisper in the night. It is rising when the world is heavy, choosing action when silence is easier, and holding faith in the small light that persists even in darkness. Her reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a young woman from a local high school, one of Emily's recent workshop participants. She had brought a handmade lantern, small but sturdy, its glass etched with tiny stars. "I wanted you to have this," the girl said shyly. "It's my way of saying the story continues." Emily accepted the gift with a warm smile. "Thank you. And remember, every time you light it, you honor the courage of everyone who came before and inspire those who will come after." That night, Emily sat by the fire with her new lantern glowing softly beside her. She reflected on the paths she had traveled, the people she had met, and the lessons she had learned. Courage, she realized, was neither grandiose nor rare. It was ordinary, persistent, and enduring. It existed in the choice to act despite fear, in the decision to hold hope in the face of uncertainty, and in the simple determination to keep the light alive. In her mind, she pictured Revere's ride, Henry Hale's letters, and the countless modern riders she had encountered, students, teachers, veterans, and everyday citizens who embraced responsibility quietly and without recognition. The legacy of one midnight had expanded into a vast network of light, carried across centuries by those willing to answer the call. As the night deepened, Emily penned one final thought in her journal. The ride never ends. Each of us, in our own time and way, becomes the rider. And each act of courage, no matter how small, keeps the flame alive for the world. She closed the journal, the lantern flickering one last time, and gazed out at the night. Somewhere in the distance, the soft rustle of leaves sounded like hoofbeats, carrying with them the enduring spirit of Paul Revere and all those who had answered the call of courage across the centuries. And in that quiet moment, Emily Carter understood fully that the story would continue. In every whispered light, in every brave choice, in every act of human conviction, forever riding onward. Autumn's chill returned, painting Boston in warm tones of amber and gold. And Emily Carter found herself once again walking the streets that had carried Paul Revere centuries ago. She moved slowly, notebook in hand, reflecting on how far the story had grown, far beyond her initial research, far beyond history books, into the hearts of ordinary people who were choosing courage in their everyday lives. Lanterns, she realized, were no longer just symbols. They were metaphors for persistence, conscience, and the quiet force that keeps communities alive. Emily arrived at a small historical society on the outskirts of the city. Inside, volunteers were arranging a new exhibit dedicated to silent heroes of the Revolution, those who had assisted Revere or acted in similar quiet bravery during the war, often without recognition. She paused in front of a display showcasing letters between Revere and local messengers. Some were written hurriedly in candlelight. Others were delicate, almost poetic in their description of ordinary life, interrupted by extraordinary duty. A volunteer approached Emily. "We've been including modern stories alongside the colonial ones. Nurses, firefighters, teachers, people whose courage mirrors what happened here in 1775. Emily nodded, her eyes misting. That's exactly it. Courage doesn't have to be loud. The ride wasn't just about shouting warnings. It was about presence, responsibility, and choice. That's what carries through time. Later, she walked down Hanover Street. the aroma of fresh bread and roasted coffee mingling in the crisp air. She noticed tourists snapping photos, children laughing, and shopkeepers greeting familiar faces. It struck her that these streets, once a stage for midnight tension and urgent decision-making, were now ordinary yet still alive with echoes of the past. Emily's mind wandered back to a visit she had made to Lexington weeks earlier. She had spoken at a middle school, sharing the story of Revere's Ride, and had watched students enact the events with care and imagination. One student, a girl of 12, paused mid-scene and asked, "If we were riding now, what would we warn people about?" Emily had smiled. "It's less about the message and more about the action," she told her. "Every generation has its own ride, the courage to speak, to act, to make a difference. You just have to be willing to respond when the call comes." That exchange stayed with her, resonating through every lecture, every talk, every quiet moment she spent reflecting on history. In her Vermont cabin, Emily lit a candle and placed a small lantern on the windowsill. She began writing letters to students and teachers who had reached out, sharing stories of courage and asking for reflections. One letter from a teacher in New Hampshire stood out. "Your lecture inspired my students to start a lantern club. Each week, they perform acts of kindness, document them, and share the results with the community. Your work has created ripples far beyond what you could imagine." Emily smiled, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. She realized that the ride was no longer simply Paul Revere's. It was a shared story, passed along through actions, words, and choices across generations. One crisp evening, Emily attended a small gathering at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Scholars, historians, and citizens gathered to discuss the nuances of Revere's life beyond the famous ride. A panel discussion focused on the often overlooked individuals who had made the ride possible: messengers, blacksmiths, tavern owners, and ordinary townsfolk. Emily listened intently as Dr. Michael Avery, her longtime collaborator, spoke about the ripple effects of small acts. Revere may have made the ride, but the people around him made it possible. Courage is a communal act. It is carried by those who step forward, quietly, when the stakes are high, when fear tempts them to remain silent. Emily nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. She had seen this principle reflected in countless modern acts of bravery: teachers staying late to support struggling students, volunteers aiding the vulnerable during crises, citizens advocating for justice, quietly but persistently. After the discussion, Emily returned to her cabin, exhausted but contemplative. She opened her journal and began to record everything she had observed over the past year: the students, teachers, communities, and everyday citizens who had answered the call of courage in their own lives. Each story, she realized, was a lantern. Each act, no matter how small, kept the flame of human responsibility burning. That night, she dreamed of Revere's Ride. The streets were shrouded in fog, the night deep and silent. Yet everywhere, she saw lanterns flickering, some bright, some faint, carried by people who understood the stakes. The whispers of the past intertwined with the present, forming a chorus of determination, vigilance, and hope. When she awoke, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The ride, she understood, was never a singular event. It was an ongoing testament to the human capacity for courage, integrity, and resilience. Weeks later, she traveled to a small town in Maine for a lecture series on American history. She spoke to an audience of students, educators, and curious citizens. emphasizing that the legacy of Revere's Ride was not contained in textbooks or museums, but lived in every choice to act rightly, even when unnoticed. A young woman in the audience asked, "Ms. Carter, how do we keep the light alive in times when fear feels stronger than courage?" Emily paused, reflecting on the years she had spent researching, writing, and speaking about Revere and modern acts of bravery. "The light is never truly extinguished," she said softly. "It may flicker, it may hide, but it survives in every act of conscience, every moment of resolve, every choice to stand when silence is easier. Courage is a continuum, a lantern passed from hand to hand, from heart to heart." Her words were met with quiet applause, but more importantly, with thoughtful silence, a collective understanding that courage was neither distant nor rare, but deeply human, immediate, and attainable. That night, Emily returned to her in overlooking a quiet harbor. The reflection of lanterns on the water seemed almost alive, flickering like thousands of tiny beacons. She thought of Revere, of Henry Hale, of Thomas Hale, and of every ordinary individual who had carried courage forward through time. Lighting a small candle, she wrote a new journal entry. "The ride never ends. Each act of bravery, whether public or private, grand or subtle, contributes to the chain that binds generations together. Every candle we light, every choice to act, keeps history alive in the present. The night may be long, but the flame endures." She closed the journal, feeling a profound connection to both past and future. Outside, the wind whispered through the harbor, carrying with it the echoes of countless riders who had traversed darkness, uncertainty, and fear, always keeping the light alive. Emily understood, in that moment, that the story she had been telling for years was far more than history. It was a living legacy, one that would continue as long as people remembered, listened, and chose courage over fear. And as the night deepened, the lanterns flickered gently, as though affirming that Revere's Ride and the courage it represented would endure forever. The following month, Emily Carter journeyed to Concord, Massachusetts, drawn by the significance of the battles that had followed the midnight ride. Walking along the North Bridge, she imagined the tension of that fateful day, the muskets, the shouts, the fear, and the resolve of ordinary citizens taking extraordinary action. The landscape had changed, but the echoes remained. The river flowed quietly beneath the bridge, reflecting the same light. Emily paused near a small plaque commemorating the bridge skirmish. A group of students approached her, notebooks in hand, eager to learn. They peppered her with questions. How did Revere feel that night? What if he hadn't succeeded? How do we measure courage today? Emily welcomed the curiosity, understanding that their interest was more than historical. It was a bridge connecting them to the enduring principle of vigilance, responsibility, and moral courage. The ride wasn't just about Revere, she explained. It was about every person who chose to act, who chose to resist indifference. Courage is timeless, and it takes many forms. In your life, it could be standing up for someone, speaking the truth, or simply refusing to look away when something is wrong. That is the modern ride. Afterward, she wandered the streets of Concord, observing small memorials, local shops, and houses that had stood since colonial times. One building, with weathered white paint and shutters, bore a plaque marking it as the home of a messenger who had assisted Revere. Emily imagined the family inside, the candlelight flickering, the fear and determination palpable as they chose to help a stranger carrying a message that could change the course of history. That night, she stayed at a nearby inn and wrote in her journal, reflecting on the quiet acts of courage she had encountered in her travels. Letters from students, educators, and ordinary citizens had become a tapestry of bravery, each thread connecting past to present. She noted the similarities between the choices of colonial patriots and modern individuals. Hesitation, doubt, fear, but ultimately action. Emily decided to organize a workshop in Concord, inviting local students, teachers, and community leaders. The goal was to connect historical acts of courage to present-day challenges. The workshop began with a reading of Revere's letters and journal excerpts, followed by interactive exercises where participants considered how they might respond to moral dilemmas in their own lives. One student shared a story about witnessing a neighbor in need but feeling too intimidated to help at first. Through the exercise, she realized that hesitation is natural, but action, even small action, is what defines courage. Another participant, a teacher, spoke about advocating for underserved students in a school resistant to change. Emily encouraged the group, emphasizing that courage is a ripple effect. One act inspires another, creating waves of impact beyond immediate visibility. By the end of the workshop, participants lit small lanterns, symbolically carrying forward the principle of vigilance and responsibility. Emily observed the flickering lights, understanding that the ride was now metaphorical, embedded in choices, compassion, and human connection. Later in the week, Emily traveled to a local library hosting a living history event. Volunteers dressed in colonial attire recounted Revere's ride and the events leading to the revolution, while historians provided context. Emily noticed the engagement of children and adults alike, their eyes wide with curiosity, their imaginations sparked. A young boy tugged at her sleeve. Why did Revere have to ride at night? Wouldn't it have been easier during the day? Emily knelt to his level. Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing. Night hid danger, yes, but it also gave him a chance to alert people before it was too late. Courage is often about choosing the hard path because it's the right path. The boy nodded slowly, holding his small lantern tightly, as though understanding that bravery wasn't always loud, visible, or immediate. Sometimes it was quiet, unseen, and deeply personal. Returning to her Vermont cabin, Emily spent evenings compiling letters, notes, and reflections she had gathered throughout the year. Each account, each story, reinforced the universality of Revere's message. Courage was not the province of heroes alone. It belonged to anyone willing to respond to what they knew was right. One evening, she received a letter from a retired firefighter in upstate New York. "I've spent my life running toward danger, while others ran away. Reading your work reminded me that courage is not always dramatic. It's the small decisions we make daily that define who we are. Thank you for helping me see the connections between history and my own life." Emily smiled, recognizing the continuity of courage across time, professions, and experiences. It was an invisible thread linking Revere's ride, the colonial patriots, and modern acts of bravery, a living, breathing legacy. As autumn deepened, Emily took a quiet moment to reflect outside by a small pond near her cabin. The water mirrored the fiery foliage, and a gentle breeze stirred the reeds. She thought of Revere Hale and all the countless individuals who had participated in the unfolding narrative of courage, whether in small towns, distant cities, or quiet homes. Each act, no matter the scale, contributed to the larger story. She realized that her mission was not only to preserve history, but to illuminate it, to help people see themselves in the narrative, to understand that bravery is accessible, everyday, and transformative. Lighting a candle on the cabin porch, Emily wrote a new journal entry. The ride continues. Every lantern lit, every act of conscience, every moment someone chooses to act despite fear extends the legacy forward. Courage is a network, a lineage, a flame passed silently from hand to hand. And as long as we respond when the call comes, the light will never fade. Outside, the wind carried the soft rustle of leaves, a whispering echo of countless riders, both past and present. Emily watched, heart full, understanding that the story Paul Revere's Ride, the revolution, and the continuum of courage was far from over. And in that quiet night, with lantern light flickering and leaves whispering in the breeze, she felt the enduring pulse of history, a reminder that courage, once kindled, never truly dies. Winter's first frost arrived, dusting Boston's streets with a silvery sheen. Emily Carter, now well into her travels, chronicling the legacy of Paul Revere's Ride, felt the weight and depth of the story more keenly than ever. The ride, she reflected, was never a singular event, nor merely a tale of midnight gallop and lantern signals. It was a network of courage, responsibility, and quiet action stretching across centuries. Each person who engaged with the story, students, teachers, historians, and ordinary citizens, added a layer to its enduring resonance. Emily returned to the North End, her footsteps echoing on cobblestone streets lined with brick houses whose walls seemed to hum with centuries of memory. The Old North Church loomed ahead, its iconic steeple reaching skyward, a steadfast sentinel over the city. She entered the church, the faint scent of wax and wood filling her senses, and placed a small lantern on the windowsill. It flickered softly, casting long shadows that danced across the pews. Here, she reflected, the ride had begun, and in these moments, it felt eternal. In the following days, Emily visited schools in suburban neighborhoods surrounding Boston, conducting workshops that emphasized active participation. Students acted out Revere's Ride not as a performance, but as a meditation on decision, consequence, and courage. She encouraged them to write letters or journals about moments when they faced fear, hesitation, or uncertainty, to explore the small acts of bravery that often go unnoticed. One young girl shared her story quietly, nearly whispering, "I helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries up the stairs even though I was late for school. I didn't think it was brave, but my teacher said it counted." Emily smiled warmly. It counts exactly because you acted when it was easier to ignore. Courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just showing up. Nearby, a boy raised his hand, eyes wide. "So if we do something good, but no one notices, it still matters." "Absolutely," Emily said. "Every act adds to the chain of light that history carries forward. Some lanterns shine bright for everyone to see, others flicker quietly, but all keep the flame alive." That week, Emily met with a group of local historians who were compiling a new digital map of Revere's route. The project aimed to combine historical records, personal letters, and modern geographic data to create an interactive experience for schools and museums. Emily contributed her own research, along with letters she had collected from individuals reflecting on courage in contemporary life. As they examined the map, the historians discussed the interconnectedness of small acts, the way one messenger, one choice, one piece of information could alter the course of events. Emily nodded, reflecting on her own experiences, documenting acts of bravery today. The parallels were clear. History repeats, not in exact events, but in the patterns of courage, vigilance, and moral responsibility that bind communities together. On a snowy evening, Emily returned to her cabin in Vermont. The forest surrounding her home was silent, save for the occasional rustle of a pine branch under the weight of frost. She lit a lantern in the window and sat at her desk, reviewing letters and journal entries she had received throughout the year. One from a teacher in Maine stood out. After reading your essays, my students organized a community courage day. They helped neighbors, wrote thank you notes to first responders, and reflected on what bravery means to them. Your work has created ripples that extend beyond the classroom. Emily felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She understood that Revere's Ride was no longer confined to history books or colonial reenactments. It had evolved into a living, breathing dialogue between generations, inspiring action and reflection in real time. That night, she dreamed again of Revere, galloping through streets shrouded in fog, lanterns flickering in windows, the tension palpable. But in this vision, the streets were filled with modern riders as well. Children carrying lanterns, teachers guiding their students, volunteers quietly helping others, each person connected to the next by invisible threads of courage. Emily awoke with a sense of awe, realizing that the ride had never truly ended. It existed in every choice to act rightly. Every moment someone chose conscience over convenience. Every flicker of bravery in the quiet corners of the world. In early December, Emily traveled to a small coastal town in New Hampshire for a lecture series. The town, wrapped in frost, seemed almost suspended in time, echoing the colonial streets she had visited months earlier. Her audience included students, teachers, and local historians, all eager to explore the intersections of history, courage, and community. Emily began with the story of Revere's Midnight Ride, emphasizing not the legend, but the human elements, fear, responsibility, and the quiet, deliberate choices made in the dark hours of night. She invited attendees to consider how they might answer their own calls to courage. A retired nurse raised her hand. I've spent decades caring for patients, often when conditions were difficult or exhausting. Your talk made me realize that these small decisions, every day, are part of a continuum of courage. Emily nodded. Exactly. Courage is rarely recognized in the moment. It is cumulative, quiet, and profound. Every act matters, whether witnessed or unseen. Later that evening, Emily walked along the harbor, the icy water reflecting the soft glow of lanterns hung along the docks. She paused to look at a small memorial for local patriots, their names etched into stone. She imagined the messengers, the riders, and the townspeople who had played roles in that historic night. Then she thought of the teachers, students, veterans, and ordinary citizens she had met over the past year. The parallels were unmistakable. Courage transcends centuries, manifesting wherever people choose to act with conscience and resolve. Lighting a small candle on a dock railing, Emily whispered to herself, "The ride never truly ends. It continues in every heart willing to respond, in every hand lifting a lantern, in every act of quiet bravery." Back at her cabin, Emily compiled notes for her next book, a reflection not only on Revere's Ride, but on the ongoing legacy of courage in modern life. She wrote about teachers staying late, students helping neighbors, volunteers advocating for the vulnerable, and everyday people acting despite fear or uncertainty. Each story was a lantern, each act a thread in a vast tapestry connecting past to present. She penned a final note for the night. History is alive. Courage is alive. Each choice to act rightly, however small, becomes part of a network that stretches across time. The midnight ride was never just a moment. It was the beginning of a conversation that continues to this day, carried forward by those willing to keep the light burning outside. The winter wind whispered through the pines, echoing the distant hoofbeats of riders long gone, yet still present in spirit. Emily smiled, feeling the enduring pulse of Revere's legacy, a reminder that courage, once kindled, is never extinguished. And as the lantern flickered on her desk, she understood fully that the story would continue in every whispered light, in every brave choice, in every act of human conviction, forever riding onward. The new year brought icy winds and sparkling frost across Massachusetts, and Emily Carter found herself once more retracing Paul Revere's path, this time focusing on the lesser-known towns and villages where his message had quietly traveled. Each stop was an opportunity to uncover stories long forgotten, to speak with locals whose families had carried the tales of courage from generation to generation. Emily realized that the ride's legacy was not only in history books, but alive in oral traditions, family letters, and community memory. She arrived in Medford, a town that had played a critical but often overlooked role in Revere's journey. Walking down streets that had scarcely changed since the 18th century, Emily imagined Revere passing silently through houses, gardens, and narrow alleys, each step a deliberate choice in the shadow of danger. She stopped in front of a modest brick home with a small plaque, "Home of a Messenger for Paul Revere, 1775. Emily felt a quiet reverence. The names etched into history were only a fraction of the courage that had occurred that night. Inside the town's small library, Emily met with a group of high school students participating in a project called Echoes of Courage. They had interviewed older residents, compiled diaries, and even written plays to represent the bravery of ordinary citizens during the Revolution. Emily was struck by their dedication and asked them why they had chosen this project. One student replied, "We wanted to understand that history isn't just stories in a book. It's real people making real choices. And if they could act with courage when things were so dangerous, maybe we can find courage in our lives too." Emily nodded, recognizing the timelessness of that sentiment. Courage, she realized, did not expire with Revere's ride. It persisted in every generation that chose action over apathy, responsibility over indifference, and conscience over fear. Later, Emily visited a local museum housing artifacts from the colonial era, lanterns, letters, and personal belongings of riders and messengers. One exhibit displayed a collection of lanterns, each accompanied by a story of the person who had carried it, often unnoticed and uncelebrated. Emily lingered over a small, cracked lantern with a note carried by Abigail Turner, 1775, warned neighbors silently while tending to her sick child. Emily reflected on the ordinary heroism of such acts. Courage was not always loud. It was often subtle, personal, and quietly transformative. She jotted down notes, envisioning a chapter of her next book that would explore these unsung heroes, connecting their bravery to the everyday acts of modern citizens she had documented throughout her journey. That evening, Emily hosted a small workshop at the library. Students, educators, and interested community members gathered to discuss the nuances of courage, historical and contemporary. Emily encouraged participants to reflect on moments in their own lives when they had acted despite fear. One young woman shared, "I stood up for a friend being bullied, even though it was hard and I was scared. I didn't think it was heroic." Emily smiled warmly. That is exactly what courage is. Heroism doesn't have to be dramatic or recognized. It is the choice to do what is right, even when it's uncomfortable or frightening. Every act, no matter how small, is part of a larger chain, connecting past to present. During a walk along the banks of the Mystic River, Emily thought about the countless citizens whose bravery had complemented Revere's ride. Fishermen, shopkeepers, housewives, children, all had contributed to the preservation and transmission of critical information. Their choices, often overshadowed by the fame of a single rider, had been indispensable. She realized that understanding history required looking beyond well-known names to the fabric of community courage that made moments of heroism possible. In her journal, she wrote, "The ride was never just Revere's. It was a collective act, a mosaic of decisions, each one small but essential. Courage is rarely isolated. It thrives in the network of human connection, passed along like a lantern from hand to hand." As January progressed, Emily traveled to a rural area near Lexington. She visited the homes of descendants of Revolutionary citizens who had contributed to the effort. Each family preserved letters, journals, or oral histories that revealed the personal stakes of that night. In one home, a descendant handed her a faded letter from a messenger, detailing the fear and resolve experienced while traversing the dark roads. Every step forward carried weight, every shadow a question of survival. But we carried the message because it was the right thing to do. Emily felt the resonance of the words. Courage, she realized, had always been bound to choice, and choice required awareness, moral clarity, and a willingness to act despite uncertainty. Back at her Vermont cabin, Emily prepared for a lecture series in Boston, focusing on the ripple effects of Revere's ride. She wanted to emphasize not just the historical events, but the enduring lessons for modern society. How could ordinary citizens act with courage in the face of moral dilemmas, social injustice, or personal fear? How could small decisions ripple outward, creating a larger impact? During the lecture, a teacher asked, "How do we instill this understanding in young people without making it feel overwhelming?" Emily replied, "By showing them that courage is accessible. It is not about grand gestures. It is about everyday choices. Each small act is a contribution to a legacy that spans centuries. Teach them to recognize the lanterns they can carry, and they will find their own ride." That night, Emily walked along Boston Harbor, the water reflecting the soft glow of winter lanterns. She thought of Revere's midnight ride, the community that had supported him, and the countless individuals who had acted bravely in unseen ways. The ride had become a living metaphor, a continuum of human courage stretching from colonial America to the present day. Lighting a small candle in her journal, Emily wrote her closing thought for the evening. The ride continues in every moment someone chooses right over easy, conscience over comfort. Courage is not confined to history books. It lives in us, in our decisions, our actions, and the way we pass the lantern forward. Every generation has its own ride, and every heart can answer the call. Outside, the cold wind rustled through the city streets, carrying with it the faint echoes of hoofbeats, whispered warnings, and the enduring spirit of courage. Emily smiled, knowing that the legacy of Paul Revere and all who had acted alongside him would continue, not only in memory, but in the choices and actions of those willing to carry the lantern forward. The final leg of Emily Carter's journey brought her back to Boston one quiet February morning, when the city was still blanketed in frost, and the first hints of spring had not yet pierced the chill. She walked along the Freedom Trail, reflecting on everything she had witnessed and documented over the past year. The students who had embraced courage in their classrooms, the teachers who had gone beyond the call of duty, the ordinary citizens who had chosen to act when indifference would have been easier. Each story was a lantern in its own right, a continuation of the legacy begun centuries ago. Emily paused in front of the Old North Church, staring up at the steeple. Lanterns had been hung in its windows that fateful night, signaling the British troops' movements. Now, in the modern city, the same location served as a reminder that history is alive, not just in artifacts or plaques, but in the decisions people make every day. She thought about Revere's courage, the risks he had taken, the tension of the dark night, the weight of responsibility, and she realized that the same spirit lived on in countless unseen ways. Later that afternoon, Emily visited a small community center where children had constructed a lantern walk to honor acts of bravery, both historical and modern. The children carried handcrafted lanterns, each labeled with a deed that required courage, helping a neighbor, standing up for a friend, advocating for change. Emily watched them walk silently through the center, the flickering lights creating shadows that danced along the walls. "This is exactly what I wanted to see," she whispered. "The ride is alive." A teacher approached, smiling. "We wanted them to understand that courage is continuous, not just a story from a history book. These lanterns represent the choices they make every day." Emily nodded, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. Courage, she understood, is neither bounded by time nor constrained by circumstance. It exists wherever someone chooses action over passivity, responsibility over convenience, conscience over fear. That evening, she returned to her Vermont cabin, snow crunching beneath her boots, lantern in hand. The quiet solitude of the forest seemed to embrace her, offering reflection and insight. She set the lantern on her porch and sat down to compile her notes for the final chapters of her book, a chronicle, not only of Revere's ride, but of the enduring chain of courage that stretched from colonial America to the present. She thought about the countless individuals who had contributed to this continuum, the messengers, the townspeople, the students, the teachers, the volunteers, the ordinary citizens performing extraordinary acts without recognition. Each story, she realized, was a thread in a vast tapestry, each decision a flicker in a larger constellation of bravery. As night fell, Emily lit several small candles around her cabin and opened her journal. She reflected on her dreams, letters, lectures, and workshops. She thought of the children she had met, who had understood that even the smallest action could ripple outward. She recalled the teachers who had inspired students, and the modern messengers, volunteers, first responders, and ordinary citizens whose quiet bravery ensured that the spirit of the ride lived on. Emily wrote, "Courage is a network, a legacy passed hand to hand, heart to heart. The ride never ended with Paul Revere. It continues every day, in every quiet decision, in every moment someone chooses to act rightly despite fear. The lanterns we carry may flicker, but they never go out." The final days of her project were spent visiting local museums, historical societies, and schools, sharing the lessons she had gathered over the year. She emphasized that history is not static, and neither is courage. Every generation has its own ride, its own opportunities to illuminate darkness with action, integrity, and vigilance. At one final lecture, a student asked, "Ms. Carter, how can we make sure the light never fades?" Emily smiled. "By acting when you see the need, by passing the lantern to others, by understanding that even small acts matter. Courage is contagious. One choice sparks another. One lantern lights another. And when each of us carries our light forward, the ride continues indefinitely." The following evening, Emily walked along the harbor one last time, the reflection of winter lanterns rippling across the icy water. She imagined Revere riding through the fog, the townspeople quietly aiding him, the letters and messages that had carried critical information. Now she understood. The metaphorical ride was ongoing in classrooms, homes, streets, and communities across America. It existed in every choice to act rightly, in every moment of moral clarity, in every flicker of bravery, both visible and unseen. Lighting a candle in her cabin and placing it beside her journal, Emily thought about the year-long journey she had undertaken. She had traveled across Massachusetts and New England, met hundreds of individuals who had embraced courage in their own lives, and compiled a living tapestry of bravery that connected past to present. She understood fully that Revere's ride was not an isolated historical event, but a perpetual call to action. "The ride is eternal," she wrote. "Each generation carries the lantern forward. Courage is alive. History breathes in our choices. And as long as we answer the call, the light endures." Outside, the winter wind whispered through the pines, carrying echoes of hoofbeats, lantern signals, and the enduring spirit of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts. Emily closed her journal, her heart full, knowing that the story she had documented would continue to inspire, guide, and remind others that courage is not bound by time, circumstance, or fame. The midnight ride, the unsung messengers, and the quiet acts of courage she had witnessed would ripple forward indefinitely, a beacon for every soul willing to pick up a lantern and answer the call.